A very good morning to all of you and a very, very warm welcome to this session. I'm session host for this particular session, and now we enter into very thematic discussion phase of this conference. And what could be the better way to enter into this, because our next session is actually going to discuss what are the data gaps, what are the knowledge gaps in the region from the global perspective, from the perspective of the IPCC. And we just showed you the launch of the regional database program, that how ICIMOD and its partner can contribute to reduction of data gap in the IPCC reports. We are going to discuss in this particular session what are the major gaps, what are the new trends which are coming, and how this can be, how the regional scientists can contribute to the global discourse. And to take this session forward and to chair this session, I have a great pleasure and honor to introduce to you Christine Holversen, who is currently the Director of Center for International Climate and Environment Research, Oslo, in short, CICERO. CICERO is a global leading organization on climate research and houses at least around 8 to 10 IPCC authors, Christine, if that is right. So you can imagine that kind of knowledge this organization come with. Christine is truly a leader. She is a former politician and was cabinet minister from 2005 to 2013. She was the first female finance minister in Norway. And also, she held the portfolio of education. Not only that, she was second in command in the country as a deputy prime minister from 2005 to 2012. She was awarded with the Communication Skills Award by Norwegian Communication Association. So, I'm very, very sure that you will have a very, very interesting discussion. I had some personal fortune of interacting with Christine in some other earlier occasions, and also in working closely with two of the panelists, scientists who are going to come on this panel. And based on that, I can say that you are really, really going to have a very powerful panel, very interesting panel. And with that, I would like to invite Christine to take the charge of this panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And namaste, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of the mountains. CICERO is very pleased to collaborate with ICIMOD and to contribute with our research on climate change. Norway is a mountain country too, but I think that you would call our mountains for hills. We have melting glaciers, floods and landslides, and we feel connected to the challenges that you face. Welcome to this plenary session. This conference is about science, policy and practice. And this morning we are supposed to concentrate on adaptation and science. We had a very interesting day yesterday. I did not expect iced tea to be highlighted, nor that James Bond should be mentioned. I did, however, expect the links to today's topic, namely the need for more attention to the mountains and getting the mountains high on the global agenda. The mountains were called the water towers of Asia and fountains of life. That is so beautiful. There is a need for more science and research connected to the climate situation in the Hindu Kush Himalaya, and to establish a broad global consensus on why this is so crucial. It is important that the knowledge that we already have can contribute more in coming IPCC assessment reports, and that scientists from this area can play a major role. The headline for this session is Adding Knowledge and Evidence, Strengthening Regional Knowledge Beyond the IPCC Assessment Report, and we will strive to answer the following questions. What new gains in knowledge have been made since the release of the IPCC fourth assessment report in 2007? What gaps are still remaining? How do we strengthen support to and networking between regional institutions and experts to bridge these gaps? How do we effectively link the IPCC and other global knowledge users to institutions and experts in the region to ensure uptake of regional knowledge? We have 5 distinguished scientists to enlighten us, and I'm sure that they will help us identify the remaining gaps in our knowledge. They all have very impressive trade records. It would take all day to go through their merits. So I have to be very brief, and I ask our panelists to join me at the stage. Dr. Atik Rahman, the Executive Director of Bangladesh Center for Advanced Studies. Professor Ravindranath, Advisor for the World Bank on Project on Climate Resilience Forestry in Bangladesh, and working on assessing the impacts on climate change on forest ecosystems in Himalayan river basins. Dr. Arun Bhakta Shrestha, Senior Climate Change Specialist and Program Manager for Regional Programs, River Basins, and Biosphere and Atmosphere. Professor Anand Patwardhan from the University of Maryland and Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, India. Please have a seat. Do we miss one? Yeah, he's coming. Our keynote speaker today is Professor Deepak Gyawali of the Nepal Academy of Science and Technology, Chair of Nepal Water Conservation Foundation, and the former Minister of Water Resources in Nepal. Please, the floor is yours, and we are looking forward to hearing your views. Please.
Thank you. Can we have the slides up, please? Yeah. We gathered here today to figure out how does new knowledge come about? Will the birth of that new knowledge be painless? And if it is going to be painful, to whom will it be most painful? The problem with generating new knowledge is that it is not only a kidney and heart transplant, it's also a brain transplant. And we can expect it to be painful to those who are used to old ways of thinking. Now, would the slides come up? Yep. Now, look at this picture. This is the 2008 breach of the Kosi. This, up and down, huh? This, okay. This is the breach of the Kosi in August 2008. The trouble is, this was not a flood. Now you'll tell me, look at all the people half drowned in water and you say it's not a flood. It's not a flood because the river was at only 60% of the flow for that month. The embankment breached because of, garden variety corruption. So it's not useful sometimes to blame nature when the fault lies within. Now, there's a blindness about this. Institutional blindness. The breach was repaired, but the cause behind that breach was never explored, let alone lessons being learned to avoid it in the future. This is a picture many of you from India are familiar with. The trouble is, it looks like a truck, it's got 4 wheels, it quacks like a truck, but it's not a truck. It's an irrigation pump. There are 60 million or so of them in India, and if you assume that at least 10% of them are being converted to also become trucks, you notice they have no license on them, and I believe when the photograph was taken, it was being driven by a 12-year-old boy, who obviously had no license. Now, the carbon budget of India goes through the roof. And these are very inefficient pumps by international standards. Now, why am I raising this? Again, to talk of the scale of the blindness. Okay. You would notice, we talk about IPCC, and IPCC, after the last disastrous attempt, acknowledging that the Himalayas were a white spot, completely blind, that we had no information on it, went to the other extreme and warned that, by 2035, all of the Himalayas will be bald, no snow. Well, it's not true. Now, why are all these things happening? It's happening because we are still too shackled by what I call too much eagle-eye science and too little toad's-eye science. Eagle-eye science, looking from the best spy satellites, would look at that truck with 4 wheels and say it's a truck. Toad's-eye science would actually go down there and look at it and say it's an irrigation pump. This is where generating new knowledge has to come to fore. This is where we have to look at new ways of knowledge generation, interrogate our process of knowledge generation. One of the problems with the IPCC, with all good intentions, has been not only too much eagle-eye science, but also that the entire peer review process is in English. Now, that Kosi breach and the flood, it's well known. People like D.K. Mishra in Bihar have been crying hoarse about it. I mean, hundreds, I don't know how many books he has written about it. Unfortunately, they are in Hindi. Now, that knowledge is there, but it does not filter up to the IPCC process at all. So there's a serious lacuna about where knowledge comes from, what is sanctioned discourse, and what is not sanctioned discourse. And this is where the surprise comes, when people are hit with it, and the painful process of new knowledge has to be brought about by some rather painful processes of activism. What you see before you is this data filter. We have 4 basic institutional styles of organizing. At the, it's too far away, can't see that, yeah. At the left, upper left corner, you have the world of the fatalist masses, the couch potatoes on TVs, who get their information from what the broadcaster thinks is important. You go down below that, you have the world of market individualism, the world of individual consultants, smart businessmen, individualists, They'll get their information no matter what. They're in the data picking mode. Even if they have to bribe the minister's secretary, they'll do it. Because if they don't do it, their competitor will do it. That's the reality. Okay. At the right of that, you have the egalitarian activist world of absolute cacophony, where everybody is dialoguing with everybody. You have to, everybody's equal. There is no commander-in-chief in the egalitarian world, But they do generate new knowledge, very uncomfortable, very clumsy. But much of the information on the environment that we have today is coming from this solidarity. Unfortunately, the climate is getting very harsh for them. Everywhere around the world, there is reaction against, NGO-generated knowledge, denial of it. And this is a very serious process, and it's getting worse around the world. The comfortable time of the early 90s is gone. And on top is where the most interesting thing happens, top right-hand corner. That's the hierarchic world, the bureaucratic hierarchism, where the issue is registration. Who has the right to get what information from whom, and who does not have the right to give out what information to whom? And in the process, the filters are very strong. Bureaucracies will filter out data that they don't like, that goes against their established mission. So if they're in the mission of building nuclear power plants or building dams, any bit of data and knowledge and information that says, perhaps there is a problem, will be filtered out. And this is where all the problems are arising. What is this? What happened? Can somebody help? Slides disappeared. Well, somebody has to put it back on, see how it comes back. Oh, yeah. Okay. Now, leave the fatalists out for a moment, and these are the three basic solidarities that define problems differently. Climate change problem, to a control-oriented bureaucratic hierarchism, is all about how to control things. So the climate problem is defined as too many people, too many Chinese, too many Indians, right? And the solution is to control that, to manage it, so that they do not make too many demands. Whereas you go to market individualism, and too many people has never been a problem for them. More people means more consumers. I remember in the 80s when China was opening up, American businessmen saying 1 billion consumers. The trouble is it turned out to be 1 billion producers. If you go to the third leg of the stool, you'll find out the world of the activist egalitarianism, where the problem is also a P problem, but not a population problem or a pricing problem, but a profligacy problem. With Mahatma Gandhi's famous statement, the world has enough for our needs but not enough for our greed, being the classic flagship statement on it. So you see that a climate problem, the same applies to water or energy or anything else that you can think of, has three different definitions of what the problem is. And if the definition of what the problem is different, you can be sure that the solutions proffered are going to be even more different. We have to live in a world where people have different definitions of the problem, whether it is at the village level or the global commons, and they are proffering different solutions. Now, under conditions of uncertainty that we have, with climate uncertainty, physical uncertainty, social uncertainties galore, how do we behave? We're talking about policy making under uncertainty. And this is where we really have to talk about many 10% solutions, many different ways of doing things, piecemeal adaptation, some programs failing, some programs succeeding so-so, some succeeding beyond even our wildest dreams. The problem is going to be if we're going to propose one solution for everything, one perfectly optimized solution. It's not going to happen. There is just too much uncertainty around. This is why, in the coming years, we have to rethink international cooperation. We have to rethink international development. We have to rethink international treaties. This is the old view of what an international treaty was, that nation states get together, come to a consensus, and sign a treaty. Well, we have seen treaties where that has happened and hasn't moved forward at all. Mahakali Treaty being one classic example right now between Nepal and India. 17 years in limbo. Kyoto Protocol is not going anywhere. But the Ozone Treaty did go forward. The Rhine has been cleaned up. So what are the lessons we learned from the successes of international regimes, treaties, and the failures? The answer seems to lie in, again, institutional pluralism, where all voices are listened to, and not only listened to and given a space at the table, but they're also responded to. It's not enough just to let people speak. You've got to respond to what they're saying. It's not enough to say, oh, we'll let the nasty environmentalists make all the noise in Ratna Park or wherever, okay? You have to respond to what they're saying. And failure to do that really means, yes, one may not like what the environmentalists are saying. They may not even be 100%, forget it, maybe not even 50% right. But even if they are 10% right, the canary has sung and there is problem in the mine. This is what we have to accept. Now, with this new reality where you have interweaving loyalties and solidarities across nation-state boundaries, whether in the scientific community, whether among NGOs, whether among multinational business corporations, it is there that consensus takes place, in that clumsy arrangement, that clumsy but constructive engagement, and that gives us the solutions, like the Rhine, which is cleaned up and the salmon is back on it, or the Ozone Treaty, the Montreal Protocol, which has managed to at least solve one part of the climate problem. Which leads me to argue that international cooperation itself needs rethinking. Until about the mid-80s, till the beginning of structural adjustment, which is nothing but fatalism in development, the northern governments gave aid to southern governments, but something changed at that point, and they decided to give aid through NGOs and bypass governments. Part of the resistance in third world countries right now to NGOs and this reaction against them is precisely that governments should be collaborating with governments, not NGOs. NGOs, northern and southern, should be collaborating with each other. Businesses, north and south, should be collaborating with each other in the manner that they are designed to function. But when you have a mismatch and you have governments funding NGOs in the south, the bureaucracies, hierarchies of the south begin to react. And also, there's a lot of distortion that sets in, and we in the NGO community have to be frank about it. Many of our NGOs are no longer in the voluntary egalitarian mode. They have become bad businessmen. And this is where much of the problem is coming. Hence, rethinking of international cooperation requires matching like with like. Governments around the world have to get together to frame better, acceptable regulatory mechanisms. Businesses have to collaborate across national boundaries to find solutions like they found for the ozone problem. And NGOs and activists have to be the canaries, continue to be the canaries around warning of dangers that the market and governments are blind to. This is where new knowledge can come about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Givalli. This was a very powerful and important speech. And you had a very interesting point. We'll come back to that. I think that you had the IPCC assessment report process in your mind when you were referring to this clumsy arrangement. And the next speaker, he comes almost directly from the clumsy arrangements in Copenhagen, working on the synthesis report, on the IPCC 5th assessment report. And we are very eager to hear you, Professor Ravindranath, because you can tell us something about how the gap is, well, maybe a bit more narrow than it used to be. Please, Mr. Ravindranath.
Thank you, Christine. Now, Christine is depending on me, people like professors like me and Anand, to speak only for 7 minutes. But we professors are used to giving a 45-minute speech, whether it's a conference or a classroom. So now I have a big task, trying to control myself for 5 minutes. And after a passionate speech from Dr. Deepak, mine will be very bland, scientific facts and so on. Sorry about that. I'm just back from Copenhagen after long nights trying to get the report approved by the 195 UN member countries. Let me try to give a few highlights of 3 working group reports and a synthesis report in 5 minutes. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Well, you know already the questions which I'm addressing. Well, I can't read from here. Firstly, well, I would like to say, in the new report in year 5, there is a significant improvement in climate modeling, climate projections. In fact, the new models have been very good in predicting the historical climate, the historical, extreme events, and even reasonably continental level precipitations. And I would say the CB5 models on which the new projections are based are more reliable than at any time in the past. I'm sure there are always some uncertainties involved with that. Secondly, for the first time, the synthesis report clearly uses phrases such as it's severe, it's, I can't even read from here, we are used to reading from that. It's irreversible and abrupt. These are words which IPCC is not used to, but we use them this time. And again, and IPCC report also for the first time talks about the monsoon and says there are uncertainties with respect to projections on monsoon, but monsoons are likely to increase and the high intense rainfall events are likely to be more. And next, the other one is, sorry, I have a slight eyesight problem also. I wish there was a computer here. The next is adaptation. IPCC also used what we call representative concentration pathways compared to what we are using SRES scenarios. RCPs, we have 4 RCPs, which says to achieve a given level of radiative forcing, or say 2 degrees warming or a 4 degrees warming, there are multiple pathways to choose. That's an important issue, unlike in the past. And the next, I have underlined that for the first time, we have a lot of scientific evidence to show that climate change is already occurring, and it's unprecedented, and the impacts are visible, and the vulnerabilities have been reported. I think this is one of the very important message for policymakers, as climate change is not something which is decades away. In fact, Obama, when he released the report on climate change from White House, he said climate change is now happening. It's not something like a distant story. And of course, again, IPCC for the first time talked about the carbon budget, and it clearly showed that there is a simple linear relation between cumulative carbon dioxide emission and temperature increases, which is for the first time. It also gave a budget how much more we can emit at all. And sixth, climate change is also looked at in the working group 2 as a risk management issue. In fact, IPCC does provide a framework for risk management. In fact, if I have time, I will try to show that. I may not have time to do that. And climate change impact is a combined interactive result or outcome of, on the one hand, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. Slightly different than what we're all used to from the IPCC 2007. And then in the 7th point, again I've underlined, which says the first step towards adaptation, according to IPCC, I'm just quoting from that, for future climate change is to really reduce vulnerability to current exposure and current vulnerabilities. And these are called building blocks for building resilience to long-term climate change. I would say this is another very important message from IPCC. And again, IPCC also talks about adaptation deficit and limits to adaptation. These are very important concepts which have a lot of political and economic implications. And lastly, IPCC also says that it's possible to have ambitious mitigation at a very low cost, at a GDP cost of 0.06% compared to the BAU, business as usual, projection of GDP growth rate of 1.6 to 3%. So the cost for the global community is very small, which is 0.06 at the global level, and it doesn't include the benefits of adaptation and reduced climate change. Next. Well, what are the knowledge gaps? Well, there are many. Obviously, climate science has been progressing, and it has progressed very quickly, to be honest, compared to a lot of other sciences. Well, firstly, if you take the Himalayan Hindu Kush region, one of the big problems is lack of historical climate records. There are very few points, unlike in other parts of the world. So we need good historical climate records at a very, at a small scale, at a finer scale, at every few kilometers or few tens of kilometers. But the historical climate data is limiting from the Himalayan region. That's one of the biggest limitation. And again, the topography, the slope, and the changes in altitude are so complex in the Himalayan region. It's very difficult for models to really, take care of all of them. It's much easier to predict climate change for like Indo-Gangetic Plain, where you have long, flat alluvial soils bled for hundreds of kilometers. It's much easier there. But here in the Himalayas, you need very fine scale climate projections, which are simply not available from the CIMIP-5 Earth system models. And next, can this light be switched off? This is. Next is Hindu Kush. Of course, this region is not part of the Cortex. It's part of Cortex, both the East Asia Cortex as well as the South Asia Cortex. But somehow both I've looked at both, and in fact, the East Asia Cortex outputs do not really simulate very well the Asian monsoon or the Indian monsoon. And firstly, and secondly, even the Cortex models from South Asia, from India, are also uncertain. There are a lot of uncertainty. In fact, one recently published paper shows GCMs are better than the regional climate model projections of Cortex. As of now, they're available. Maybe in future they may improve. So there is a lot of uncertainty about climate projections for the Himalayan region. It will remain so. And then there's a need for, of course, IPCC has given the new framework for risk assessment, and we need to really develop methods how to really assess the vulnerability according to the new definition, how to assess the exposure, how to assess the awards and so on. So there are, I'm already, time is running out, professors not good in giving a 7-minute speech, and I would conclude by saying that there's a need for developing criteria and guidelines to develop incremental adaptation strategies and transformational adaptation strategies. In fact, there's a clear, in fact, the two things which would really help us to talk to policymakers on climate change, even given the uncertainty. There are 3 points I would say. First, to conclude that climate change is already happening. There is significant evidence around the world, especially from countries like Europe and so on, where there are a lot of research, historical, current, we can show that climate change is already impacting, number one. Number two, risk, looking at climate change as a risk management, just like the insurance companies look at it, or national security is looked at, or even the health insurance and all, they look at it. There's always a risk. It can be quantified, and you can design a strategy, an insurance strategy for a given risk. Second. Third, we need to state that there's a need for incremental adaptation strategies and a transformational adaptation strategy. Incrementally is something what we are doing, watershed projects, community forestry, soil water conservation. They all are part of incremental adaptation strategy. But what's required to adapt to climate change and high increased variability is transformational climate change. Well, I have had a lot more. I really want to talk about this diagram, but I'm sorry, time is running out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ravi. There have been some progress, but we are not satisfied. We need more knowledge and information about the situation. Our next speaker, please take the floor, Dr. Shrestha. We are eager to hear your points of view, please.
Okay.
I think we need some help from your slides is incoming.
Yeah, I can start while the slides are being loaded. My presentation is a bit of complementary to what Professor Ramanath has just spoken about. He gave a broad overview of recent developments in IPCC process and what is lacking. Now I will come down to our region, the HKH region, and talk mostly about my working area. It's about the cryosphere, the frozen sphere, and the freshwater resources. That will be what I will be mostly talking about. Now, what has happened after AR4? AR5 has happened after AR4, right? That's what we know, and that I could put it there and stop it, but I will not. I wanted to, go through some of the points that were included in AR4, and what has changed in AR5, and what's missing, and what are my thoughts about it. Okay. Now, traditionally, the assessment reports do not contain much about Hindu Kush Himalaya region, basically. The sub-region is called Asia, and occasionally they have some paragraphs or some boxes about Himalaya. In AR4, there are some mentions. Mostly, again, I cannot see it from here, but mostly, when we look at AR4, the message is quite alarmistic. There is a box on Himalayan glaciers, and we know about that box. Deepak ji has mentioned what it mentions about, and we know about it. It talks about the fresh water that comes out of the glaciers and how it might very seriously impact water resource availability, and so on. So that was the situation of AR4. Now, despite all those shortcomings, I think one and there were a lot of researches conducted in this region, trying to understand how the glaciers are changing, trying to understand how this means, what it means in terms of freshwater availability. Is it going to be as acute water shortage as had been, presented, or is the scenario different? So, I don't know how to go to the next slide. Right. Yeah. Okay. Oh, that was quick. Okay. Now again in AR5 there is not tremendously much about the Himalayan region. Again, Himalayan region is very much limited. The biggest part in the report is this box, box 3.1, which gives a more realistic view about the Himalayan glacier, as opposed to what was mentioned in AR4, that the Himalayan glaciers are the most fast retreating glaciers in the world, whereas here it gives a more realistic, more scientific basis about it and shows that yes, it is retreating quite fast, but they are not the fastest retreating glaciers in the world. And quite heavily cites a paper by Tobias. I think, Tobias, you are here. Raise your hand. Yes. And this slide actually compares what is happening globally and what is happening in Himalaya. And it shows that, yes, it is retreating fast, but it is not the most fastest area, right? It also talks about freshwater availability as opposed to AR4. It now comes up with suggestions that, although glaciers are retreating, the freshwater availability is most likely not going to reduce as we had envisaged earlier. The next new message that comes is that the contribution of cryosphere to freshwater is not that big as was suggested by AR4. And it also gives some figure about that. So in this way, the AR5 and AR4 are quite different, and AR5 gives more realistic, more science-based information about cryosphere and freshwater changes in the HKH region. Now, having said that, I would like to also talk about what I call AR myth. I think we have some myth about AR. Yesterday also we heard about, IPCC report says HKH is a data gap region, Nowhere in the report it says HKH is a data gap region. It doesn't present much reports about HKH, and that's because it's a data gap, but it doesn't say it's a data gap region. We have to, conclude that from what is available, what little is available there. White spot. It nowhere says it's a white spot region. It presents as a white spot. It doesn't say. We have to conclude it based on what little is available there. So sometimes we like mystifying those global reports and try to get too much out of it, I think. IPCC reports are not solutions to everything. I think we are expecting too much from IPCC kind of report. Its strength is on global analysis. How the world is changing, the social and economic changes are happening, how the emissions are changing, and what it might cause in a broader scale. But its weakness is actually in regional and local analysis. I think that has to be made clear. And for that, I think we should not always look at the IPCC kind of report, but look at something what's happening close to our doorsteps. And actually, after AR4, as I said, a lot of attention was drawn to this area, and a lot of things have happened. In my remaining 1 minute, it's not possible to be explained. So I just wanted to put one slide, little bit of advertisement about our own work, which is a sort of, large-scale modeling exercise we did in the upstream part of Indus, Ganges, Brahmaputra, Salween, and Mekong to see what the projected climate scenarios, the CIMIP 5, might cause in terms of impact to cryosphere and freshwater availability. And as had been mentioned in AR5, we found out that, yes, the glaciers will shrink quite dramatically. The range could be somewhere between 20 to 55% reduction by the middle of the century. But when it comes to freshwater availability, there will not be acute freshwater availability shortage in that time frame. Not in the annual water availability, not in the seasonal water availability. So we have, through this, I think, most comprehensive assessment using best available data sets and best available model, for a large scale we have been able to demonstrate it. And there are a number of other publications, number of other works that has come out in between. Our own work, another work is about the glacial assessment, decadal change in glacier, the whole HKH glacier mapping, and there are other many reports which I will not be able to mention here, has come out. But unfortunately, not all of them had made it to IPCC somehow. I don't know. Maybe the timing cycle process is not compatible, or some other issues are there. But the conclusion is that IPCC does not include everything that is important for this region. Okay? Now, major gaps, I'm confining to this very topic. What I would like to say is that, our studies and various other studies have corroborated that in the future there will not be serious issue about water availability in terms of annual and seasonal water availability. However, indications are there that frequency and magnitude of extreme events might be very important and might exaggerate in the future. And this is also, we know, one area of high uncertainty, and that I would like to flag as one of the major gap and needs improvement in the future. Precipitation information is a biggest impediment to our, enriching our knowledge in this region. So we should have a better analysis about, precipitation distribution due to the topography, etc. One last point in major gap I would like to say is this disconnect between large-scale, analysis and small-scale studies. This is also related to what Deepakji mentioned about eagle eye and torch eye science. Both, I think, are necessary, but somehow they are disconnected. I think now the need is to connect them. So that's another thing I would like to highlight. My last point is that, we can learn a lot from global assessment like the IPCC one, but to act, to adapt, we need comprehensive regional analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think it's important that, of course, the IPCC processes should take or highlight the special situation in the Hindu Kush Himalayan more in the future, but we can't expect them to answer all our questions. So we need knowledge adding the IPCC processes too. Now our next speaker will be Professor Pat Vadhan. I'm so pleased that you are here and can contribute to this discussion. Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm really happy to be here. In particularly, I'm happy to be speaking at an event organized by ICIMOD, because as you will see, hopefully at the end of my 7 minutes, allotted 7 minutes, that it is that this is exactly a great example of the kind of boundary spanning institution that we need urgently today. So I think in that sense, it's quite appropriate for this session and for this talk here. Our keynote speaker has given a really rich exposition of the political economy of knowledge production and use, and I think there's lots of very important ideas there that we need to reflect on. What I will try and do in the time I have is really share some ideas on the connection between science and implementation, and the relationship that has to how we think about the production of knowledge, how we think about the science enterprise, and how do we think about the implementation enterprise. And I will also try and draw a little bit from the IPCC. As we think of where we are now in terms of adaptation, it's worth reflecting back a little bit on the history, and particularly on the way the scientific narrative has evolved, because I think that gives us a good sense of how thinking on adaptation has changed over time. And what I've tried to do here in this slide is just give you a very short headline summary of 5 assessment reports from an adaptation lens. A bit hard to do, but I'm going to make an attempt. Way back in the AR1, the first assessment report, adaptation was really viewed as an adjustment. So you have a problem, we adjust to it. It's a sort of a classical sort of response model where we adjust to projected or actual changes in climate. Around the time of the second assessment report, there was a lot of work that tried to look at adaptation, the idea of autonomous adaptation, that this is something that does happen. It's not something that is new. And therefore, the idea that adaptation serves to modify climate impacts, and so that sort of gives you your residual vulnerability. The third assessment report really, I think, saw adaptation and vulnerability as issues in their own right, processes that needed to be studied, learned from, and worked on. And the recognition that we do have a large and actually growing adaptation deficit even before we consider the challenges of future climate change. The fourth assessment report, in many ways, emphasized the connections, sort of integral connections between what happens in climate, what happens in socioeconomic processes, and sort of looked at adaptation as an element of that more complex set of interactions. And the concept of mainstreaming really became dominant. And this also you see reflected now in the policy dialogue with, say, the national adaptation plans, which is really a means for mainstreaming. The fifth assessment report, I think, and Ravi mentioned this as well, is where you really saw an emphasis on learning and reflexivity, that you think about adaptation as an iterative process of managing risk. It's not one time, it's not one-off, it's ongoing, it is going to require a long-term robust institutional arrangements. And so this diagram, in many ways, in the fifth assessment, AR5 SPM or Working Group 2, I think captures the notion that research and implementation are integrally related. And they're actually part of that same process. They are not separated, but that they are really part of that overall process of response, where you have to continually go in a cycle from scoping to analysis to implementation to review and learning. So the notion of learning, I think, in many ways comes up very strongly in the AR5. And what that means is we have to think about learning in a much broader way. The typical notion of monitoring and evaluation, so we keep talking about M&E. M&E has become very much a buzzword, right? So everyone wants to do M&E. But very often the purpose of M&E is limited to accountability. Has money been spent for what it was supposed to be spent? But I think if you look at it more broadly, in a sense, adaptation is not something that we have all the answers to. We will never have all the answers to. So which means we need to embed learning all through that process of implementation, which means we need to be able to connect the process of research with the process of implementation. Okay, looks like there is a parallel commentary running in the back somewhere. And which means we need these multiple loops. We need a loop that allows us to do what happens from outcomes and inform actions. But we also need to think much more broadly at what one might call sort of triple loop learning. Are we even addressing the right problem? Not just has this intervention modality worked or not, but how is the problem framed? And I think this issue of framing also came up in the keynote talk. What I think this requires, therefore, is if you take this to its logical conclusion that adaptation is an ongoing process, it is iterative, it needs to be thought of in the long term, that scientific knowledge is not perfect, information is not complete, and we will keep getting new information and new knowledge as we go along. And in particular, we are very often going in areas which are outside the space of historical analogs. So if you are outside the domain of historical analogs, you have no idea of even whether your intervention modality is the right one or whether it will work or not, which means you have to sort of build that in. Arun talked about what the IPCC reports can and cannot do, and I'd like to emphasize that as my first point, that these reports can actually do much, but they are primarily assessments of the peer-reviewed literature. That is their strength, but that is also their weakness, which means that this connection back from practice to science is very weak. The process does not have effectively the ability to capture much of the practitioner knowledge that is out there in a whole variety of shapes and forms. Our keynote speaker talked about knowledge in other languages other than English, but there's an entire array of experience and knowledge that is simply not there. And you know, it's just like the classic measurement problem. We often think that we can only know what we measure. If we don't measure it, it doesn't exist, but that's not the case. It does exist, except that it's not there. So what do we need if you think about that broader agenda? I think what we need is a response at multiple levels. We need new disciplinary knowledge. We need to continue to advance those building blocks, whether it's climate projections, whether it's behavioral science that tells us about how response works. We need those building blocks. But we need a lot of the connections between those building blocks, which are weak. We need to really emphasize cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary knowledge. You know, knowledge about indicators and measurement, knowledge about institutional design and governance, knowledge about cross-scale interaction, part dependence. There's a lot of that building, lot of that glue that holds these building blocks together, which is missing. And finally, I think very important, we need to not just think about the knowledge, but in terms of agenda setting, we need to think about new approaches for knowledge generation and use, which emphasize this notion of learning by doing, rather than this linear process where we do the science, establish the theory, and then think about, okay, how do we apply this theory in practice and implement? And these two are disconnected. We need to have a much different approach to knowledge generation and use. So let me conclude with sort of some implications. And I'd like to draw implications both for science and also for implementation. For science, I think there is a tendency in many science funding agencies to think about implementation as not our business. That's not our problem. Someone else does it, right? So you should, so if you go to funding for a science agency, they want to see, what you're doing in terms of advancing science. But they don't understand that in many instances, we have to now move to this more, a mode of co-production of knowledge, where the practitioner community and the implementation process has as much to contribute to new knowledge as science itself. And that the process of science and research, in fact, should foster implementation by both creating organizations or networks, like what ICIMOD does, that represent a partnership between multiple communities. There's also implications, I think, for implementation. I work very closely with the GEF, which is, perhaps the best known supporter of global environmental issues. The implementation agencies have a similar issue. They think about science as something which is separate. Someone else does it, it's not our problem. We want to get our limited money out into the ground. That's an excellent objective, but without learning objectives being embedded into project design, we will in fact have lost a unique opportunity to inform what we are doing and to actually generate the kind of knowledge that will advance both science and implementation. So in some ways, I think the message for me is that we urgently need ways by which we can build that connection between knowledge and practice in a more integrated way, where sort of you go from a linear model of do the science first, get it right, then worry about implementation, and then maybe at the end of some time think about what we have learned, has to be replaced by one which is much more integrated and much more iterative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Patadran. I think this is very crucial questions, and I'm sure that the audience would like to discuss it and ask some more questions connected to that. Our last speaker this morning is Dr. Raman. Please, the floor is yours.
Madam Chair, ladies and gentlemen, great pleasure to be here. we are discussing this next 2 days in the framework of science policy practice. What does IPCC fit into this? As we have heard, is most in the area of science, with a view to influence decisions so that good practices can happen. One of the tragedies of scientific knowledge search is we emphasize too much on good practices, and all the bad practices that we have done and really learned from, we don't write about it. So most of the learning comes from what did not work rather than what has worked. So the whole literature that comes about is what has worked. So that is the basis from which we come, and every world is full of success stories. If the world was full of success stories, 2/3 of the world population would not be below $2 a day, 1/3 below $1 a day, and 1/3 of the population malnourished in the 21st century. Nonetheless, knowledge has to move on and get the best knowledge. IPCC, first I stands for intergovernmental. An intergovernmental panel is one which is, oh God, why didn't I get it? Intergovernmental panel is a decision where all the governments agree to make some decisions. We know the United Nations, we know SAARC, we know many other intergovernmental agencies where we know that decisions are not that easy to be made by intergovernmental process. However, we try to make science acceptable. Each and every word in IPCC has to be accepted by each and every government. That's the process. So there are limitations. Nonetheless, this is probably one of the greatest success of human race, that 5 such studies has taken place, and climate change is in the center of the global agenda, at least in talks. In actions, it will take some actions, as already happening, but not much. Now, in terms of climate change impacts, it is already happening and now. And climate change is already happening. If you go to the areas in the coastal areas of Bangladesh, millions of people are raising their plinths of their houses with their own money, own time, own efforts. Nobody is giving them. Some knowledge they might get, some they intuit, they have intuition, they understand it, and they say, we haven't got any options. Things are happening. Climate change is here and now, and it's real. There are migration patterns in Sahel which is being modified. There are extreme events. In the last decade has increased by 10-fold in 1 decade, which is not normal statistics, can't explain it. Whole of the emphasis on IPCC was to keep the planet within 2 degrees centigrade, which is one of the most desired goal. Many of the scientists, just as they come out of IPCC, would say, we have crossed 3 degrees already. How do you get back to 2 degrees? So there are serious questions, and as we have heard, glaciers are receding, and vulnerability of the mountains particularly lies in its topography and the huge number of ecosystems that is on the slopes and rapidly changing. There is a whole debate about uncertainty. When it comes to climate change, everything has to be certain. When President Bush bombed Iraq, did not need that much of certainty. When each country decide to, have their nuclear arsenal, the certainty is somebody is going to hit somebody, so we are going to blow these weapons, and we have weapons capacity to blow up the planet 200 times, all the species of the planet. So uncertainty is not a criteria in most decisions, either in the government or in the NGO or in the private sector. We work with uncertainty. Science has to reduce uncertainty. That's the main purpose of science, trying to reduce that. And significant progress has been made towards that. There is the whole issue of funding in climate change adaptation, climate change everywhere. And as I go around the world, meeting many heads of government, first thing say, hey, you guys told us there'll be money in climate change, where is the money? And there are, esoteric money, proverbial money, but it hasn't come on the table. Who is doing the spending right now? All the poor of the world. They are paying from their own pocket to fight against climate change. The rich have not started paying, maybe a little for capacity building, this, that, and the other, mostly building their own capacity. But there is some money in that. Where is the money? So when government says, hey, you climate activists, you told us this happened, that happened, there's no money. We have created this agency, that system, nothing has come yet. And what was supposed to be paid by end of 2012 has now been shifted to 2020. And there are doubts if anything will happen. So who gets it, how much, when, how to, these are becomes big issues. How do we resolve that in climate change, in adaptation? Adaptation is already happening, people are doing it, various countries are doing it, and poor are the most vulnerable, and there is already huge amount of displaced people across the world. And IPCC 4 had said there will be about 300 million people by end of the century. So, should we just adapt and keep there? I, for one, believe that mitigation is the best form of adaptation. If we do not do mitigation, then adaptation costs will increase very soon. As Ravi has said, there is limits to adaptation. We will reach the limit. In many cases, we have already reached the limit to adaptation. When an ecosystem has collapsed, when a human system has collapsed, that is the limit to adaptation. So that is already reached in many, many systems, and mitigation must be done by who? Those who polluted the world most, particularly in the early days, the rich countries, subsequently those who are polluting rapidly, the new emerging countries, and each and every citizen, each and every country will have to do their bit, but that's not good enough. It has to be done rapidly, otherwise the limits of adaptation would be reached, and loss and damage is the concept that's emerging, and it will not go very far. Just to conclude, where and how this knowledge will be made, for which we need to do that. For science policy people, science policy practice, it has to be across the board. There has to be institutions in these regions dedicated to many of these disciplinary areas. There is only one science, which is the global science. And the scientists, sadly, we have not found anything better than peer review as our scientific standards. So be it. But scientific institutions must be built in the government, in the private sector, in the civil society, in the think tanks, everywhere, so that we can take these processes forward. So in the next 2 days, that would be the journey of how do we take science for the people forward in a rapidly changing climate world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rahman. I think I'll open the possibility for the panel to make some very short comments on each other's speeches before I open the floor to the audience. But I'm sure that the audience is eager to ask some questions. So do you think we should go directly to the audience?
Combine our committee.
Okay. Then I think we'll open the floor for the audience. Feel free to ask questions. Please be brief, and don't be shy, because I know there is a lot of knowledge among the participants, and I think we'll have 3 questions and then some answers. Please. Please.
Thank you. My name is Chenchu Nobu. I come from Bhutan and work for the Ministry of Agriculture and Forest. Firstly, I want to thank all the panelists and the keynote speaker for giving us an overview on this IPCC report, which means with regard to adaptation, mitigation, so on and so forth. Let me put my observations. For Bhutan, most of our glacial lakes and glaciers are above 4,300 meters above sea level. And I happened to be there in 2010 along those lakes and glaciers. And I went there because when 2007 IPCC report was released, I think there were many skeptics whether climate is really warming or global is really warming. But when I reached there, I found that the glaciers are retreating, receding. You can see physical symptoms. And if you look around, there is no settlement, no pollution. Why it's happening? So definitely there is a physical symptoms that you could see that it's happening. Now if you look back 2007 and now 2013, within our Hindu Kush range, not much has improved. 2007 says data gap, knowledge gap. Even in 2013 says data gap, knowledge gap. I'm asking what we have been doing for last 5 or 6 years. Or in short, what as a Hindu Kush country member can we do? The other question I want to say is, do we need to wait for another IPCC report to act locally? Because we are not helping. We are just discussing. We are just analyzing. What we need is, at the local, we need the action. And to do the action, of course, as last speaker said, we need financing. And probably, we believe that financing should come from those developed countries who were responsible once upon a time for emitting a lot of GNH gas. So in that sense, collectively, I am just thinking, within this Hindu Kush, range, how each participating institute, country member can contribute to this knowledge gap, to this data gap. We'll be there to support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I saw. Yes, please.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Karman Sari. Sorry, I happen to be from Bhutan as well. I really don't have a question for the panelists or the Chair. I only have some issues which I feel could stimulate and catalyze further deliberation and debate within this conference period as well as beyond. We have been discussing a lot about the IPCC assessment report and the report that we see. As far as I am concerned, the science that is being put in front of us by the IPCC report is quite fine, but fine at its scale. That's the global study that's been done by IPCC. The issue is not about the relevance or about the paucity or data shortage we have in the Hindu Kush Himalayas. It is actually about how relevant those information, science-based information that are there, that are relevant to the Hindu Kush Himalayas. IPCC assessments are relevant for their scale, but the clamor for data and information in the Hindu Kush Himalayas is actually emerging from the local level. And when we are not able to actually make use of those information and data, translate it to the local scale, and make it relevant for the people, this cycle of rediscovering the issue about data gaps and data paucity emerges every now and then. I think that we need to find some ways how to actually bring those information, science-based information, to the local scale and make it relevant for the practitioners at the local level. The other aspect of IPCC report is the whole report, starting from the first to the fifth, are based on good science. informed by the science has to be used. That is the core essence of scientific knowledge and its utility, and actually removing those data problems we have with knowledge. They have to be used.
Thank you.
I'm sure that we have a lot of think tanks in the region, but we have very limited practitioners who have.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
It's not about data paucity or lack of data. I think how to use those information that are there.
Yes, thank you very much for a very important point from you. I have one more speaker here, and then I'll let the panel comment, and then we come back to you. Please.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Arjuman Nizami. I'm from Pakistan. I'm struggling with one comment which is repeated here, knowledge gap and data gap. My own feeling is that we have lots of data, but they are in silos. They are not shared. Also, in terms of knowledge, we have knowledge, but probably it is not really brought to the right level that people can make benefit out of it. So I would like to appreciate, your comments on this, because I feel that we have lots of data, even at regional and local level. Perhaps lots of work is going on, but the information remains in silos. The other one is a comment from the panel on practitioners' knowledge and practices. What mechanism do you have to bring those practices into information of the wider world, that they can also benefit from those practitioners' experiences and knowledge? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll ask Professor Ravi to answer first, and then I think you.
I know there were 2-3 interventions on data knowledge gaps. We had it yesterday also. Well, there are the kind of data gaps we scientists talk about for the region. I would say, as an IPCC author, as a scientist, firstly, we do not have a large number of historical observed climate data, period. That's one of the very important, and you can't do anything about it, because unlike, say, in India, there are literally tens of thousands of rain gauge stations where there are data is available for 100 years. You can make much better, reliable climate projections or even vulnerability assessments. That's what we mean historically. One of the critical climate data gap is historical observed rainfall, temperature data for the region is missing. That's one of the problems because of the terrain and so on. Secondly, there are very few long-term observed studies in the Himalayas and also in India. In fact, some of the best long-term observed monitoring of the vegetation shifts, arrival of birds and species migration and so on and so forth are from Europe because of historical regions. This region lacks, secondly, observed data of behavior of plants, animals, birds, and so on and so forth. And thirdly, impact modeling studies, published impact modeling studies. I know very well about my field. I work on climate change and forest. I know all the studies published from the region. There are so few. So I think that's what we mean by, otherwise a lot of other knowledge, but this type of knowledge is missing that can go into IPCC and other things. And the second question was on, well, we don't need to wait for the perfect science. We don't need to wait till we reach the bridge to cross it. We need to plan now. The science has shown, as I said, there are 2-3 issues. There is enough scientific evidence to show climate change is happening and it's impacting, and there's a discernible, measurable, observed impacts. So there's no question about any uncertainty at all on this aspect. And thirdly, the scale of projection, yes, would be a problem. As I said, for Himalayan region, it will be a problem. It's not easy to solve. Getting climate projections at a finer scale is not easy. It's not possible.
Thank you very much. I will give the floor to Professor Giavali, and then you, Mr. Radnaman, and then I'm back to the audience.
The sentiments expressed here from the floor are quite valid, and with ICIMOD, we have just begun a very small study. Arun and others are also involved here, colleagues. What we found out was that, yes, IPCC is meant to be at the global level and so on and so forth, but a lot of our own work tends to be looking up rather than looking down. And we found out that, in Nepal, almost 100% of the people in the villages depend on spring sources for drinking water. And these springs have never been mapped. Forget at the national level, not even at the district level. No, people, of course, know they have springs there, and that's where they get their water. but this is never mapped, and they're drying. And we have no idea why they're drying, how they're affecting people, how many people are affected. So we began this one-year pilot study, very small. I don't know, it occupies what, 0.000 whatever percent of ICIMOD's budget, probably will be a rounding error in their annual report. But it turned out to be the first of its kind. Okay, and what we have discovered is quite alarming. There are reports that certain district headquarters in Nepal might have to be relocated because springs are drying out and there's no water. Now, these are extremely serious. Why is this important? This kind of knowledge generation is important because we find out that climate change, you can make it an excuse for anything these days, but the drivers behind this drying up are other very powerful socioeconomic and other drivers going on. Okay? Wrong use of technology, over pumping, I mean a whole lot of these drivers, to which when climate change uncertainties add on in the next 25 years, 50 years, 100 years, whatever, it'll probably be worse. So what we are arguing now, some of us, is that there is a need to do this kind of very focused towards our science down there to find out what is actually happening at the grassroots, and then use that as the platform to understand, improve things there first, improve those drivers and those problems, you know. And then you are more ready to adapt to climate change problems when they occur even worse in intensity and frequency. But if you're ignoring those problems right now, the climate change wallop is just going to make things much worse. So this is where that rethinking of science and the kind of, you know, towards-eye science that needs to be done is extremely important.
Thank you very much. Professor Patladang.
Yeah, just very briefly. On this question of should we wait, I think the answer is very clearly no, because there will never be perfect certainty. There will never be perfect foresight. So you will always be a situation where you have decision making and uncertainty, so which means that you can only think about what robust strategies there are, what can be done. The second is the sort of, and the starting point for that often is current vulnerability. To understand what the current sources of vulnerability are is a very good way to go, because in doing so, you are likely to do many things that you will need to do anyway for the long term. The second point I'd like to respond to was this issue about knowledge gaps and what can be done. I think one of the things that we need to do is generate what I would call as credible knowledge, or knowledge that leads to action. Very often, if you look at so one of the issues with, say, an assessment process like IPCC is that it assesses the literature. Its function is not solution oriented, right? So it is saying what's out there and what's the synthesis, what do we learn, what's the summary of that. So the issue there is it's not directly tied to developing or implementing solutions. So you need knowledge, credible and validated knowledge that can generate solutions. And what is credible depends on, it's like beauty in the eye of the beholder. So what is credible depends on who the beholder is. If the beholder is a scientist, they want to see a paper in a journal. If the beholder, you know, if you are looking at an investor, they want to understand whether the knowledge is sufficient to support investment decisions, which is often a very different thing than what scientific community would want. So I think this issue of generating credible information that leads to action and what constitutes credible information is an important one.
Thank you very much. We'll go back to the audience and allow 2 or 3 more questions. Now we are. Now we are active and eager. Please.
Thank you.
Yes. Please.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Dun Suo Chen, come from Chinese Kingdom Sciences. My major is regional ecological economics, major in less developed areas. My question is for mountain peoples, the even lack of everything, lack of knowledge, science, technology, funds, capacity, and infrastructure. So essentially, where does knowledge come from? I think it's come from the reality, nature, practice, and studies. So my question is, to what extent the IPCC's prediction results is become realities? And the second question is, because I remembered last year's on Warsaw Climate Summit, there is a resolution about the responsibility and solutions. That is for developed countries and developing countries, and to take the same responsibility for climate change. And my question is, how to make the mountain countries, mountain areas, into one of the key study areas into IPCC's objectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we will allow one more question, and then, no, it's the man over here. And then we have to
fit into the system.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now the lady over there, you're the last one from the audience, please.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Yesterday I have talked little about the root cause of climate change, behind of it. Today I just want to highlight a few points. I want to make it easiest to the delegates here that the main reason of the climate change is there is 4 or 5 points I have highlighted. First is unmanageable distribution of the finance, and this happened from the top developed countries to least developed countries, and they have dismanaged every level of the society. I don't know what they have proposed and what they want to do, what their aim, but this is happening. There are so many European countries have been gone in austerity condition. That is one of the point, because the most developed countries are using the least developed countries to enforce somehow this policy. This is not direct, this is not formal, but informally they are doing this. And second is the scientists who are using their knowledge anti-human and anti-nature activities, and sometimes they also, this climate change reason is also their psycho activities. And third is the regional leaders, the religion leaders, anti-human and anti-nature activities is also carried out on this side. And the big corporate houses, they have a ridiculous investment policies they have enforced, which is only and only to create the destruction and disaster in the society. I don't know why that is.
Me, madam,
so this type of the activity must have to stop, otherwise the climate change is not possible to control it. So
much.
we have to see the every side of this
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I will open.
The interesting comment has come. One of the comments is that there isn't enough data coming from practitioners. This is partly true, but there has been a number of very good initiatives, particularly in this region and across the world, where there is a whole movement called community-based adaptation, and there has been 8 world conferences. The last one was in this hall in April of this year, in the presence of the Prime Minister of Nepal, because Nepal is the leader of the least developed country now in the climate negotiations. And huge number of experiences have come in, and the next conference is in Nairobi in April 2015. So this is building up. However, the problem is to get into the peer-reviewed literature. South Asia is full of excellent PhD thesis which doesn't go beyond that institution. Similarly, a lot of work is being done which does not go to the graduate from grey literature to the published literature. and there has to be an effort in trying to do so more, and some effort have been initiated, but there has to be much more structure. There are other initiatives going on. One experience many of you might know is called Karya, trying to understand what happens in Himalaya and Hindu Kush in snow melt and additional precipitation that has impact on the society downstream and midstream, middle ranges. So things are happening, but how do you equalize that? And IPCC is a target, but science continues, knowledge search continues, and we have to persuade in doing that.
Thank
the
you
best
very much.
effort is collaboration between institutions.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Ravi, please.
No, I want to dispel one myth that these extreme rainfall events and all, floods and so on, are caused by, other human or socioeconomic stresses. Extreme events are caused is a climate phenomena, but its impacts will be determined by other local management, local, stresses. So extreme events are a part of climate phenomena, maybe to some extent climate change. Secondly, the Chinese question, yes, IPCC models, the CIMIP-5 models are very good, in fact, have very well predicted or estimated the historical observed extreme events and the temperature changes. That means it gives us confidence for making future projections.
Thank you very much. Please.
I will talk about data gap again. My experience looking at IPCC process is that, IPCC tends to incorporate publications which are actually more like review articles, not taking individual small studies, but studies which actually take into account all those small studies and come up with a larger kind of review. So I think to bridge the gap between what is happening here and what goes into IPCC, I think we should go into that kind of studies. Regional assessment I highlighted in my presentation also. I think that is something which is very necessary, and I would like to also inform that ICIMOD is undertaking an initiative called HIMAP, Himalayan Monitoring and Assessment Program. So that would be an opportunity for us to, actually corroborate all the information knowledge that we are having in this region and then bring it at a larger scale. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And then Professor Patwardhan.
Thank you. I'll be very brief. Just 2 points to leave you with as we go into the break. The first is that uncertainty cannot be a factor and excuse to stop decision making. There is always uncertainty and decisions are always made. The question is, do we have knowledge, sufficient knowledge to support action? The second point I'd like to leave you with is we keep hearing the term best practice. To me, sometimes it's tyrannical. Best practice might work okay in situations where incremental response is to be done, but we have heard very often the use of the term transformational adaptation, and there actually best practice or slavish adherence to best practice can actually stop us from looking for more innovative solutions.
Thank you very much. Professor Gyawale.
2 points. One, the gentleman from Pakistan. Yes, what these floods are now telling us is that, and climate change is telling us, is that future will not be like the past. Now, the consequence of this for my hydroscience and hydrotechnical studies is that much of the methodologies we use go out of the window. We're used to taking past data, regressing till we are blue in the face, and projecting that the probability of once in 100 years or once in 1,000 years is so much. But if the future is not going to be like the past, no matter how much you regress those past data, you're going to be wrong. So there's a serious methodological problem already staring us in the face. That's the first thing. So we have to rethink. Second thing is, if CO2 emitters and methane emitters do not mitigate, and that includes not just the north, but even those of us in the south. And let me say, Nepal, we're supposed to be rich in hydropower, but we have more thermal generation added in these last 5 years that is greater than the national utility. 700 megawatts of diesel added in the last diesel generation in the last 5 years, when it has taken us 100 years to have 700 megawatts of hydro in the NEA system. What this means is that if we do not mitigate our CO2, then all of us will have to adapt even more painfully in the past.
Thank you very much. I think it's quite easy to sum up this discussion. It is. Because from different angles, I think you underline that there are still some data gaps. We do have data that are in silence, but we still need more data about the Hindu Kush Himalaya. But then we can't expect that the IPCC process will cover all the information and knowledge we need. We will still, if the IPCC report, assessment report is going to be perfect, seen from our side, we still will need some knowledge and science from at the regional level. That is the first point, and I think the next point that you've all agreed on is the need for science to collaborate with people at the local level and the principle of learning by doing, and that we need, and that no size will fit all, because the situation is very different and it is a very complicated area, and that we have to collaborate between the local level and the scientists and by cross-disciplinary knowledge. So I know that many of you in the audience would like to ask some questions. There will be 3 days and your opportunity will come back to you. I would like to thank the panelists, for our distinguished panelists and the keynote speaker for very interesting speeches this morning, and we all deserve a cup of tea. Thank you very much.